Well, thank you so much, Patrick, for that immensely kind and humbling introduction. And thanks to my great friend Edmund Lee and to all the sponsors and hosts of this spectacular event. And thanks to each and every one of you. You know, there's clearly a reason we're here. And that's because a subject like design that used to be pushed off way into the corner of a business school or a company or an industry, or a thing like cities and city design and urban planning that used to push way in the back of the way we talk about doing public policy, are now front and center. You probably heard the news today that our dear friend John Maeda, a leader in this field of design, president of RISD, was named a partner at Kleiner Perkins, the single most important venture capital firm in the world, investor in all of the high-tech companies and computing and software and biotech, was named as the first ever design partner. That isn't epiphenomenal. That isn't an extraordinary occurrence. It's because design and creativity are the driving forces, not only of making cute products that people want to buy, not only of making designer goods that people feel attracted to, but the building blocks of our great cities, our great communities, and our entire economy. You know, think about what we've been through here in Hong Kong, in Asia, throughout Europe, especially in Europe, and in North America over the past decade, half decade. Think about the economic turmoil the world has faced in the financial markets, on Wall Street, in Hong Kong, in London, the so-called financial crisis. This is a financial and economic crisis, people say, on the order of the Great Depression, on the order of what happened in the middle of the 19th century, when we shifted from an agrarian economy to an industrial economy, the kind of thing the great economists like Adam Smith and Karl Marx wrote about. What we're going through isn't an economic and financial crisis. It's a fundamental change in the way we work, in the way we do business, in the way our economy is organized, in the way our cities are run, in the way we compete. You see, we are in the midst of the greatest economic and social shift in human history. Think about that for a minute. The shift we are all living through, all of us here in this room, all of our brothers and sisters, our children, our sons and daughters, our relatives and friends, all of us on this planet today, all 7 billion plus of us, are living through the greatest economic transformation in human history. And at the bottom of it, at the core of it, at the center of it, is this thing each and every one of us share: our human creativity. If you trace back through the millennia, if you roll your mind back through all of human history before us, there was a very simple equation that governed our economic life. Really, it's as simple as anything you can believe. For all of history before us, for all of our forebearers, for our hunter-gatherer societies, to our simple cities that grew up around trade routes, to our larger and larger trading and mercantile centers, even into our industrial firms, companies, and communities, through all of that history, what gave us wealth was a simple formula. We used our hands and our strength, our physical labor, to transform raw materials and natural resources and God-given gifts into economic wealth and value. Oh, and that went on over the millennia and over the large sweep of history, culminating with the great Industrial Revolution. The great Industrial Revolution that happened several hundred years ago, beginning perhaps in parts of Italy, migrating through Belgium and Flanders into Amsterdam, and of course across the waters into England. Manchester, Birmingham, Leeds, the great industrial centers of textile making, steam power. The great areas that Adam Smith wrote about, that Karl Marx bemoaned. And then moving on to the United States. The great manufacturing centers of Detroit and Pittsburgh in steel and Buffalo and Cleveland, the Rust Belt of industry. Productivity increases of 100, 200, 300, 400, 500%. Wealth the world has never seen. The creation of giant industrial cities. Mass migration from the farms to the industrial centers. But still, that economic equation was exactly the same. Exactly the same as thousands of years before. It was human beings using our arms and our legs and our backs and our strength to transform petroleum and coal and iron ore into those industrial products. The great economists had a formula. In order to achieve economic growth, they told us, one had to maximize the three basic factors of production: land, labor, and capital. These transformations, these economic revolutions, the rise of industrialism, were incredibly disruptive events. Transformative but traumatic. And if you think about, just the past 150 years of our history, just the dawn of industrialization, what that did to our societies. The growth of giant companies, the growth of giant cities, the growth of nations. But think about the trauma and disruption. Think about what Karl Marx wrote about when he chronicled how capitalism was both economically and politically revolutionary. The rise of the great isms: capitalism, communism, totalitarianism, fascism. Massive economic depressions throughout the 18th and 19th century. The Great Depression of 1929 rolling through the 1930s. Major class conflicts percolating throughout the advanced and the emerging world. Worker struggles, labor struggles, class struggles. 2 world wars. Yet those economic transformations don't measure up to the economic transition we are living through today. For the first time in human history, we are reinventing what it takes to create productivity and innovation and economic growth. We are reinventing the means of production in a way not Adam Smith, not David Ricardo, not Karl Marx, no great economist could ever anticipate. By the beginning of the 20th century, we began to see agriculture begin to fade as a way of generating wealth. It used to be that 80, 90, 100% of us worked in or around the agricultural sector. But as we moved to the 19th to the 20th century, agriculture began to fade, and more of us in the advanced countries began to take up work in the great factories of the industrial era. Now, in a place like the United States or the United Kingdom, of course, Hong Kong, it's always been the case, most of the advanced countries of Europe and Asia, 1% or less of us work on farms. But beginning around 1980, we began to see manufacturing and industrialism go through the same kind of transition that agriculture did before. We began to see the industries that propelled growth begin to shrink due to technology, automation, robotics, more efficient production systems, and of course, the shift of much of industrialism to this part of the world, to China. Industry began to decline from 50 to 40 to 30. Today in the United States, where I was born, or in Canada, or in the advanced countries of Europe, you know what percentage of people actually touch products and make things? 5% or less of the workforce. Add in the 1% that works in agriculture, and that means 6%. Just 6% of the workforce, of the population, of the advanced economies are actually involved in using physical labor to make food or to make things. Well, what happened? Our economies didn't evaporate. We didn't stall and go into a prolonged stagnation. Poverty didn't rise up and engulf us. No. Beginning in the past 20 or 30 years, we began to invent a new kind of economic system. That's what I mean when I say we are going through the greatest economic transformation in human history. One where it is not land, labor, and capital, it's not raw materials and physical labor that power our growth, but something much more inextricably and intrinsically human. You see, other people, I'm not the first person to try to grapple with this. Other great thinkers before me, like all who try to think about our society and our economy and design and architecture and urbanism, I, like all others, stand on the shoulders of giants. The great giants who came before all of us. Many, many others have talked about this shift from the industrial age to a post-industrial age. The shift from manufacturing to services. The rise of a technology economy, a digital economy, a cybernetic economy. And, in the words of one of my great inspirations and mentors, the late management thinker Peter Drucker, who said we are moving from an industrial age to an age of knowledge, where the key to economic success in our time and in the future would be less what we could make with our hands and produce in our factories, but more the knowledge we would generate that would be used to catalyze new technologies, new industries, new ways of working, new ways of doing things. Well, Patrick was very nice to mention my book, The Rise of the Creative Class. And about a decade ago, when I was trying to really figure out this confluence of factors, economic, social, cultural, that were reshaping our society, I began to dig into what was really, truly new about our time. What was really, truly new about our economy. What was really true and new and different about our cities. What was behind the rise of innovation, high technology industries. What was behind the rise of design. Why is it that Steve Jobs, the great visionary of our times, was so different than those great inventors that came before him? What made him different than Thomas Edison or Henry Ford? What was leading to this fusion of art and culture and technology and design that was transforming our economy? And I came across a book in the library as I was doing my research, written by a great psychologist named Robert Sternberg. And almost on the first page, in the preface to that book, he had a paragraph which puts this change quite plainly. He said, if you come across a great CEO or great economic visionary, a great product designer, an industrial designer, graphic designer, interior designer, if you come across a great musician, a great artist, a great entrepreneur, a great industrialist, and he went on. He said, you've come across the same kind of person. They're all creative people. You see, it's not knowledge, it's not information, it's not technology that's powering our economic revolution. It's something much more basic. In fact, all of those categories stem from our creativity. As I wrote in Rise of the Creative Class, it is not just innovation that propels economic growth. Innovation is a subset of creativity, technological creativity. The world is filled of innovative ideas and innovative products that never get off the shelf. In order to make an innovation successful, it needs to be paired not only with great technology, but with great artistic and design creativity. But not only that, a product not only needs to be technologically innovative and well-designed, it needs to be coupled with economic creativity, entrepreneurship. Design, technology, and entrepreneurship, innovative, technological, economic creativity are all required. And for those to succeed, there needs to be the kind of civic and social creativity, because creativity is not the product of any great individual mind. Creativity is the product of many minds. Of many minds in combination, combining and recombining to generate the truly new. It requires a container. And that container is our cities. Creativity is not something that comes from on high, but God gave us, a natural resource that can be pumped out of the ground. It's something that we all share. Every little boy and girl, every one of your sons and daughters, every one of your grandkids, each and every human being has a deep reservoir of creativity. Our font of economic growth, in contrast to oil and iron ore and coal, is inexhaustible because it comes from all of us. Now, a couple of facts and figures to put this all in context. At the turn of the last century, the 20th century, most people worldwide worked in and around the farm. We were agricultural societies. Less than 5% of us in the most advanced countries worked in science, technology, innovation, entrepreneurship, arts, design. The management professions were members of what I call the creative class. By 1950, we had gone through the economic revolution. We had become an industrial economy. Still less than 10% of us were employed in the creative economy. Beginning in 1980, the economic tsunami begins to take place. Over that time, as manufacturing has shrunk, as agriculture has been reduced, becoming more efficient, the rise of the knowledge, innovative, and creative professions has surged. Millions upon millions, hundreds of millions of new jobs created, of new firms and industries founded in design, in innovation, in technology, in media, in entertainment, and the list goes on, all represented by you in this room. Now, in the advanced countries, upwards of 35% of the entire workforce, upwards of 35% of the entire workforce are members of the creative class in science, technology, innovation, the knowledge professions, management, engineering, design, media, entertainment, and so on. They produce 50% of the total wages and salaries, and more than 3/4 of our discretionary income. And that's just the average. In a place like Singapore, or in the northern European countries, in countries like Belgium, or the Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, it is already 45 to 50% of the workforce. And if you take a large city like New York, or London, or San Francisco, or Paris, or Hong Kong, we are already talking over half the workforce. Half the workforce, as much as the zenith of the industrial, over half the workforce today are members of the creative class. Now I got to tell you where I got this idea. It didn't come from studying the creative designer. It didn't come from studying the Steve Jobs innovative entrepreneur. It didn't come from studying the roboticist and the geneticist and the software developer. It came from studying factories. What I learned in my studies of factories throughout the Rust Belt of America, throughout the heartland of Europe, throughout the most advanced factories of Japan and the rest of Asia, is that the truly innovative factories, the ones that led the Industrial Revolution, had discovered a secret. And that secret I learned from the plant manager of a steelmaking factory outside Nagoya, Japan, when I visited his factory 2 decades ago. They had turned the process of making steel in that factory from a 2-week endeavor to a process that took less than 10 minutes and looked like rolls of paper coming off a paper mill. And I said, how did you do this? What great scientist at MIT or other leading engineering universities, the University of Tokyo, what great research and development facility had invented this? And he said, Professor de Florida, you have it wrong. This great innovation wasn't made in a research and development center or a university. It was made right here in the factory by the workers. The factory itself, he said, had become the living laboratory. And then I realized where I learned this first. I learned it from my father. My father's name was Louis Florida. He was born in 1921 in Newark, New Jersey. My dad took up work in a factory at age 13 when he was old enough to get working papers to help support his poor working-class family. My grandmother and grandfather worked. My father and their 6 siblings all worked in factories to make a single family wage during the Depression. My dad worked in that factory from the day he was 13, and he could get working papers to the day he retired at age 65. When I was a young boy, I wanted to see where my dad went to work. And at 9 or 10 or 11 years old, I used to ask my father if he would take me to the factory. He would get dressed in the morning, he would get in his car and drive away. I wanted to see where my father worked. My father always told me the same thing. I work in the factory so you don't have to, son. I work there. It's your job to get an education and to get ahead. But I was persistent, and I would ask again and again and again, and I would press my father. And on Saturdays, when the factory was running overtime, he would relent. And he would take me to that factory in Newark, New Jersey, in the great industrial districts across the river from Manhattan. I would enter the giant brick factory and see the machines whirring. My dad worked in an eyeglass factory. They made eyeglasses almost just like this. Plastic frames like these, metal frames like many of you are wearing. I would watch the machinery stamping out the frames, the plastic frames, plating the metal frames. And my father would see me fascinated by technology. And he told me this as a young boy, perhaps 12 years old. I've since heard it from many great business leaders and CEOs. My father told me it first. He said, Rich, it's not the machines that make this factory great. It's the knowledge, it's the intelligence, it's the creativity of the people that work here. You see, creativity is our core economic resource. It's what each and every one of us has. It lies deep within each and every person. The key to economic growth in the future is not that we can build an economy on a creative elite. It's to stoke that creative furnace that lies deep within every single individual. This is our greatest social challenge. As our society divides between the creative haves in our great cities like Hong Kong and Tokyo and Paris and London and New York and San Francisco, and the middle drops out of manufacturing, and we have many toiling and low-wage service jobs. We have to bridge that gap. And there's only one way to bridge that gap. That's to see every single person as a resource to be harnessed, to see every single person as a creative person, not just a creative class, every single person as a creative person whose energy, whose capability has to be harnessed. That really is the key to our future. So the first part of our economic shift is apparent. We are moving from an old, declining, fading industrial order. Just like Marx talked about, just like we moved from an agricultural age to an industrial age, we are moving from an old, fading, and it's holding on. It has its fist clenched. It does not want to let go. Its leaders do not want to let go their grip, but it's fading to an emerging, nascent, creative order that each and every one of us are not just participants in, we are stewards and shepherds of. A new age that is emerging out of the ashes of the industrial age. And that's what our economic crisis is about. Not a financial collapse, not a Wall Street crisis, a clash of the old industrial order that can't release its grip and the rise within its belly of a new creative age that requires the creative contribution of everyone. You see, creativity requires diversity. Every single human being is creative, each and every one, and that's who will win. Those communities, those companies, those industries, those cities that understand that it takes the creativity of all. Creativity does not respect the social categories we have imposed on ourselves. Creativity comes equally in both genders, boys and girls, men and women. It cuts across race, ethnicity, nationality, sexual orientation, all of the categories we have imposed on ourselves. In the great Silicon Valley, in the San Francisco Bay Area, that is held up as the beacon of the technology revolution, that is held up as the place others want to emulate. More than half of the entrepreneurs and business founders came from countries other than the United States. They come from Asia and India and Europe and Canada and the world over. Creativity requires diversity. Well, if the economic revolution is upon us, if the creative revolution is emerging, if creativity is the font and driving force of our economy, there is a second revolution that we are living through. That revolution is occurring much more gradually and slowly. That revolution is just now becoming apparent to us. You see, alongside the creative revolution is a second revolution. That's why we're here today talking about design and the city. The container, the driver, the focal point, the organizing unit of the industrial age, the thing all of us grew up with, the thing my dad worked for life. The economic and social organizing unit of the industrial age was the large vertical corporation. John F. Kennedy's words to Americans: what's good for General Motors is good for the country. What's good for General Motors, and that could be said of any country and its dominant firms. What's good for the companies is good for the country. It was the corporation that structured our economy, that created jobs, that built wealth, that built cities. That age is over. The social and economic organizing unit of our age is the city itself. And in that sense, we are not only the containers of creativity, but all of us who are architects and urbanists and designers are in effect the CEOs and stewards of this new economy and its new containing organization. The city, not the corporation, is the core organizing unit of our time. It is the place that brings together people, that mobilizes creativity, that cuts across disciplines, that allows us as creative actors to combine and recombine, to generate those new ideas, to use our technological creativity, to combine that with aesthetic and design creativity, to fuse that with economic creativity. It's where the artist and the designer and the innovator and the entrepreneur meet, and we mix and we combine and recombine until something hits, like a Blade speaker or an Apple computer, or on and on. It's what Silicon Valley is. It's a place of the constant recombination of talented people from across disciplines. It's exactly what a great artistic scene, a great design scene, a great city, a great music scene. Someone asked Jack White, the great musical artist, the great guitarist, founder of the White Stripes, what made Detroit a fantastic music scene for Motown music and soul music and rock and roll music and electronic music? Gave rise to the Motown, the Jackson 5, Stevie Wonder, Madonna, the White Stripes, Kid Rock, Eminem, and the list is endless. And he said, well, that's simple. There's a lot of great musicians in Detroit. And there's a lot of great drummers and bass players and guitar players. And they all form bands And they form new bands, and they combine and recombine. And then they find some interesting designers and artists to work with who want to create their image. And they find great production engineers and recording engineers and marketing people. And out of that constant churn, one or two of those bands break through. That constant combining and recombining that takes place. You see, my other great mentor, Jane Jacobs, the late urbanist, said this. They asked her what she thought was her greatest breakthrough she made in her life when she was in her 80s. She said, I think I figured out something that's puzzled all other economists. That's sort of gone past them. I don't know why, she said. She was so humble. I don't know why they didn't put their finger on it, but it just went past them. She said most of the great economists from before thought that what economic growth comes from is from great companies harnessing those raw materials, great companies harnessing that labor, great companies being near ports and making things in mass quantities. She said companies are really good at making things more efficiently and driving down the cost of production, creating economies of scale. She said, but they don't create new things. They don't innovate. We may think they innovate, and at times they may, but what's really the driver of economic growth is the kind of real innovation, the creative destruction that comes from people coming together in cities. By coming together in our little neighborhoods, in our communities, by rubbing shoulders, by interacting, by feeding off one another. When designer meets artist, meets economist, meets entrepreneur, meets innovators, that idea of the truly new. And we create a little small company, and we take it to the next level. It's cities themselves. Well, think about what's been happening over the course of the past centuries, but culminating now. In the year 1800, when the Industrial Revolution was starting off, guess what percent of us on the face of the earth lived in cities? 3%. By the year 1900, we had become a fully industrialized economy. The industrial engine was in full force. 15% of us lived in cities. By the year 1950, when the industrial economy hit its zenith, 30% of us on the world's face lived in cities. Now, as has become a cliche, more than half of the Earth's population, 3.5 billion of us, live in cities. We are putting tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people in cities every day. This is happening throughout the emerging economies of Asia, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East as we urbanize. By the year 2050 or 2100, we will have 3/4 of the Earth's population living in cities. 4 to 5 billion of us living in cities, creating a truly urban world. And the real task ahead of us, and the task that we're not prepared for, is not only how to build a new creative economy of companies, not only how to use design in technology to make great products, not only how to make better and more efficient buildings. The real design challenge is how do we build the cities of the future? How do we build these new containers, not just that reflect transcendent design and aesthetics and advanced technology? I just spoke last week to the Smart City Expo, the people who are expert in putting sensors in buildings and sensors on roads and developing driverless cars and new automated train systems. No, those are all pieces of the challenge. The real challenge is how do we devise cities that work well and efficiently and sustainable and are livable, but are the real containers that unleash the full creativity, the full possibility, the full capacity, the full prosperity that we should all enjoy. This is the grandest of the grand challenges of all. Bigger than climate, bigger than environment, bigger than energy. It subsumes them all. How do we design the cities of the future? And not just so Hong Kong is better, not just so New York is better, not just so London and Paris are better, but so as we build these cities throughout the urbanizing world, the emerging economies, the developing world, throughout most of China and the rest of Asia, throughout Latin America and Africa and the Middle East, we can do it in a way that is not only harmonious with the environment, not only takes into consideration natural factors, but unleashes the full creativity and economic potential of people. That's what I've studied for the past decade. Now, it's an emerging science, and I'm not going to tell you I have all the answers. None of us do. It's like we're starting at the beginning of the industrial era. We're just beginning to invent the machines that economists would write about. We haven't even gotten to the point we have advanced modern management that we saw in factories. We're just beginning, but I've begun to distill some principles, I think, from looking at great cities and looking at the research of others, and I want to share them with you. I want to share them. You see, we have this great myth out there, and you might have heard it. And this great myth is that in a global world, all of our economic activity is spreading. It's spreading out. And this is propagated by thinkers, particularly in the United States, captivated by the rise of China as a new economic force. They see the global world, and they have this very simple metaphor. The world is flat. The world is flat, they say. The world is flat. In a global world with new technology and transport and cell phones and fast planes and fast trains, economic activity could spread across the world and flatten it. Well, it's true. For very simple things that are made, factory-produced items, cars and television sets and other industrial products, and for simple kinds of services like a call center where you call to get a product service update, call to complain or get some advice, yes, that can be moved abroad. But for the important things, for the innovative things, for the things that require design and technology and creativity, as the world spreads, it also concentrates. And those two things are happening together. The spreading of activity worldwide, but the concentrating of activity in cities, in metropolitan areas, in what I call mega regions. You see, ours is not a world of corporations and nation states anymore. It's a world of cities and metropolitan areas and city-states. The way we look at this is we took the satellite images of the world when it's dark, at night, and we analyzed and computerized those pictures to provide an estimate of what were the real economies, not the national economies, the real economies that power the world. And what we discovered is there were 40 mega regions. The Boston, New York, Washington corridor, the area that runs from Pittsburgh to Chicago, Greater London, Greater Tokyo, Seoul, Hong Kong through Shenzhen and Guangdong, Shanghai, Beijing, Mumbai and Bangalore, Rio de Janeiro and Sao Paulo, and I could go on. 40 mega regions which spread across cities and sometimes across national borders, which house less than 18% of our population, produce more than 2/3 of our economic output, and 9 in 10 of our technological innovations. Right here in Hong Kong today, a city region that produces, well, 350 to 400 billion US dollar equivalent of economic output. If you take that mega region that surrounds this, that's about 25, 30, maybe 40 million people, and over $500 billion in economic output. You take the New York, Boston, Washington corridor, Greater Tokyo, you're talking about 2 trillion plus, one of the 5 largest economies on Earth. In Asia, there are 40 of these mega regions, 13 of them are in Asia. I mentioned a few. Those 13 mega regions house 500 million people and produce $6 trillion in economic output. We're not just talking about strengthening the city or the metropolitan area. We are talking about building mega regions that will spread and densify, that will grow outward and upward, building cities of the future that are bigger than anything we could have imagined. You know, a century ago, the biggest cities in the world were 1 million, 2 million, 3 million, hard-pressed to find a city of 5 million in the year 1900. Oh, by the year 1950, New York City was 15, 20 million. There were other cities pushing 25 million. Now today, scholars are predicting that we will have in the near future, in the next century, cities of 50 to 100 million, mega regions of 100 million plus will become commonplace. We are talking about not just making the urban core functional, not just replicating Paris's left bank or London's Soho or New York's downtown. We're talking about building giant mega regions. Now, what are some of the characteristics? Well, Patrick was so kind, he mentioned my theory of the three T's. The three T's. What I say in that theory is that if you're going to build a city of the future, you have to do three T's simultaneously. The first T is one that everyone is familiar with. Technology. A great city of the future has to have great technology. It has to be on the forefront of technological innovation. It has to invest in technology. It has to develop entrepreneurship and venture capital. It has to have great, spectacular universities doing research and development. But I lived for nearly 20 years in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania was the technological leader of the 20th century. It was a leader in steel production, switching, robotics, all across the board. Electronics, technology, invented the flat panel display at Westinghouse Corporation, and I could go on and on. It was a center of innovation in everything from steel production to electrical and chemical and across the board. Yet Pittsburgh saw its population decline from 1 million to 800,000 to 750,000. It's now 300,000 people. The technologies that were invented in Pittsburgh, and now that's being reversed, were shipped to New York and Silicon Valley and Tokyo and Hong Kong and across the board. Because Pittsburgh was failing at the second T, talent. Talent. You not only have to be a technology leader in the creative urban age, you have to be a leader in talent. You have to have a great educational system, as Hong Kong and much of Asia does. But you not only have to bring up talent, you have to retain talent. Pittsburgh had spectacular schools. I taught at a great university. My colleagues at Carnegie Mellon, though, and my students were going to Apple and Microsoft and Google and all the great technological companies leaving Pittsburgh. And I talk about this in my book, and it's very important to share this message with all of you. Hong Kong would feel great that you top the scores in education and science and math and what they call cognitive capability. And clearly, success in the creative age requires more cognitive capability, better science and math studies. But people always bemoan the United States and say science and math is fading and failing. The United States never doesn't even hit the top 20. But somehow in the Silicon Valley, and now that's even shifting, it's moving into the urban centers of San Francisco, in the urban parts of Manhattan, down from the suburbs of Boston into Boston. But somehow in the United States, even with those fading science and math scores and low IQs, the high-tech new innovations keep coming. That's because there's a second kind of intelligence skill that we've identified that powers the creative age and that lives in cities. We call it social intelligence capacity. It's that Steve Jobs kind of skill, the ability to manage people, lead people, bring people together, harness resources. When cognitive skill and social intelligence skill come together, that's what really powers economic growth. And talent means not only developing cognitive skill, but the ability to mobilize resources, lead companies, develop entrepreneurship, and change the game. But those two are necessary, but on themselves not sufficient. The third T is tolerance. Tolerance. And Hong Kong stacks up pretty good. In our metrics, Hong Kong ranks about 22nd in the world in technology, about 35th in the world on talent. And the third T is tolerance. Tolerance. I already told you, creativity requires diversity. Creativity annihilates those social categories we have imposed on ourselves. Creativity requires a tolerant, open-minded environment. In our research, we've identified some curious correlations. Communities that have a strong artistic and cultural quotient, that invest in the arts, but not only in the high arts, in symphonies, and ballets, and orchestra halls. Communities that mobilize a music scene, an art scene, a design scene. Communities where these kind of strange, weird, iconoclastic people who paint and make music and write novels and design something new, where they can fit in and they can mobilize resources, I call it the Bohemian quotient. Communities that have a high Bohemian quotient also have a high development, innovation, economic quotient. And if you think about it, the Silicon Valley that I mentioned, in California, where the high-tech companies were born, from Intel to Microsoft to Apple and to Google to all of them, this was in the San Francisco Bay Area. The San Francisco Bay Area, the birthplace of the 1960s music and artistic revolutions. Tolerance. Oh, and the second one is open-mindedness to different kinds of people, the ability to attract people from the world over, to be a melting pot where people. And Hong Kong scores quite good on this index. It's in the top 12 countries worldwide, 12 places worldwide on this tolerance score. We look at an index we call the gay index, the ability of a community to be a welcoming home to the gay population. Not because the gay population is necessarily more innovative or more enterprising or more entrepreneurial. A place that can welcome gay people and artists and bohemians is a place that can mobilize resources around new things and new ideas. Now, I mentioned that what's happening now is our communities are dividing. Our cities are dividing into the creative haves and the creative have-nots. And we have to end that. We have to overcome that. That's a great challenge of our time. We have to dig deep and we have to stoke the creativity inside each and every person. And I'm going to tell you how it's being done. Being done by a good friend of mine. His name is Tony Hsieh. You might have heard of him. You might have even heard him speak. Tony founded his first company in his 20s. He sold it, and he became involved with the online shoe distributor Zappos. Tony sold that company to Amazon for $1 billion. His company's located in Las Vegas, Nevada, a city with one of the lowest creativity quotients of any advanced city. A great city, but a city that's economy is not driven by design and innovation, but by casinos and service businesses, hotels and retail chains and simple person-to-person services. Well, Tony had a headquarters there for Zappos out in the suburban area of Henderson. And he worked very hard on that company. And he worked very hard to turn his employees, who were basically returning phone calls and taking orders and packaging product, to turn that into meaningful work, good work, high-paying work, creative work. He began to turn those service jobs into creative jobs. He began to and there are hundreds of thousands of people doing this work. More than 45% of the workforce now in advanced countries are doing this simple service work. Well, he started to make it not only service work, but meaningful and creative work. He began to organize his workers in teams. They could design their workstations. They could engage in team building. They became a real community. And then one day it dawned on Tony that he couldn't do this kind of work out in the suburbs, that it was lonely and isolated out in the suburbs. His workers were traveling huge distances and spending all their money on cars and transportation and to rent or buy a home out in the isolated hinterlands. He had a design solution. He would move that company to the old, burned-out downtown core of Las Vegas where nobody wanted to be. Not on the Strip, where the casinos are, where the casinos were, where no one in this room has probably ever been, in the Fremont section. And he bought up the old city hall and he began to buy old condominium buildings. And he said, I'm not just going to build a company. To be successful, I will build a city. I will build a city because it's a city which gives my workers community. And it's a city where innovation comes from, where people can mix and mingle and have serendipitous innovation. It's a design of a community. And if I build a city where my workers can live close by to work, and they don't have to own a car, and they can have a nice apartment, and they can walk or bicycle to work or take transit. If I can build a community that's compact and dense, I can reduce their costs so they can stretch their dollar further. I can turn my service worker into a middle-class person. I can give them a real shot at life. He began to invest in coffee shops. He began to invest in bookstores. He began to invest in incubator facilities. He began to encourage his friends from San Francisco and the Silicon Valley to move to Las Vegas to be part of the mixture. He began to see a bridge between the old way and the new way. He began to see a way to build a community that could tap the creativity of each and all, of every person. You see, the design of this city of the future has to take into consideration the creativity of everyone. If the old city in the West in the United States was a city of sprawl and suburbanization. A city of further and further apart, of isolation and alienation, where the serendipitous interaction, where the person-to-person communication, where the face-to-face interaction, where the ability to combine and recombine could no longer take place because people were spending hours in their car. The solution today is to build tower cities. All across Asia, our success is going to be measured in the Middle East in the bigger the towers we build, and there's an arms race to build the biggest tower and the biggest tower district. That isn't a design solution either. In fact, just massing more towers in the center can create a kind of vertical sprawl. If the suburbs create a horizontal sprawl, just massing more and more towers can create a vertical sprawl where people live in the tower complex. They have breakfast there, they have lunch there, they go up and down an elevator. It's the design of the street. It's the design of the interaction. It's the combination, for those of us who are architects and urbanists and designers, it's that crucial combination between just the right amount of density, and you know it when you see it. If you're in Paris, or you're in London, or if you're in lower Manhattan, where the buildings are the right size and scale, where they're set back just enough from the street, and where the action takes place in third places. Not just the workplace, not just the home, the coffee shops and cafes and bars and nightlife places and parks and bike lanes that cause this interaction, this mixing and mingling, and not just of a creative elite. What makes our cities great is the fact that in these places, in the subways, and in these public spaces, in these third spaces, all of humanity confronts one another, because so much creativity, of course, comes from the street. Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Michael Dell, so many great entrepreneurs were college dropouts. And while 9 in 10 college graduates have a job in the creative class, 40+% members of the creative class today did not complete college. It comes down from the top, but it comes up from the bottom. So our challenge is to begin to design the cities of the future that have this right combination of density and interaction. Too much sprawl and too much height gets us in trouble. But we have to build cities and communities that optimize this kind of interaction and that have the spaces, the third spaces, the informal places, the gathering spaces required for the creative engine to spur. Now, how big is this challenge? Let me give you a sense of how big this is. I already told you that we're going to put we have about 3 billion people in cities now. We're going to put another 2 to 2.5, who knows, maybe 3, maybe more billion in cities over the course of the next century. We're going to put more people in cities over the course of the next century than ever were in cities before. We're going to spend more money building those cities, more money on city building in the next century than in all of human history before, hundreds of trillions of dollars. It is imperative that the greatest challenge we face as designers and architects is not how we design the greatest next products, is not how we design the latest correct building. It is how we design the cities of the future. Anyway, I'm a professor, which means, trust me, I could sit here and talk to you all day and night, but the clock on the wall tells me I'm near the end of my time. I want to end with a story. I think you'll find this story interesting and maybe informative. It was maybe 15, 20 years ago, I was invited to the city of Seattle to help Seattle rethink its economic growth and development, how to rebuild its downtown. And we were walking around downtown, and downtown Seattle at the time was very depressed. It has now reemerged as a great downtown core, but at that point it had a lot of abandoned buildings, a lot of boarded up storefronts, a lot of homeless people. And as we passed by a couple of coffee bars and a bookstore and art galleries, I saw a magnificent new structure rising in the distance. It was a curvaceous building, unlike anything I had ever seen at that time, and it was being designed by none other than the great Frank Gehry. And I asked my host, I said, well, there you have something you can rebuild your city around. A monumental new building by one of the greatest, if not the greatest architect of our age, none other than Frank Gehry. And I thought to myself, well, what would this building represent? And I asked very quickly, how was it being supported? And my host told me that the building was being underwritten by the great Paul Allen. Paul Allen, the co-founder with Bill Gates of Microsoft. One of the world's most innovative companies and one of the world's most wealthy, fabulously wealthy men, worth tens of billions of dollars. And at first thought, I said, well, this is easy. This is obviously going to be the new Seattle Center for Science. Because Paul Allen was a great scientist. He wrote computer code. No, that's not what it is, Professor Florida. I said, okay, I understand. It's got to be your Seattle Center for Invention and Discovery. It was not science, physics, and math that motivated Mr. Allen. It was inventing new technology. No, you're wrong. Okay. He's wealthy beyond, with untold billions. It had to be the Seattle Center for Entrepreneurship. As we say in the United States, 3 strikes and you're out. I was out. And I asked my host, well, what the heck is this new Frank Gehry building? And the answer that came back floored me. It was the Jimi Hendrix Experience Music Project. You see, you never know where creativity is going to come from and where the inspiration of creativity will flow. When I was a young boy struggling in New Jersey with a working class father who bought me a guitar, my boyhood idol was Jimi Hendrix. That's who I wanted to be like. I wanted to make my guitar sound like Jimi Hendrix. Well, my life turned out very differently. Bill Clinton, when he was interviewed by Elvis Costello, said what motivated him was playing the saxophone until he realized he couldn't be John Coltrane. It wasn't Albert Einstein, the great scientist, was it? It wasn't Thomas Edison, the great inventor. It wasn't a Carnegie or a Rockefeller, the great billionaire. It was Jimi Hendrix, a young African-American kid from the ghetto who took an old guitar and wired his own pickups to it and plugged it into the phonograph in his father's home, who, when he enlisted in the Army, used every opportunity to play with his mates in the South, in the segregated South, and played country music in Nashville. He toured with the Isley Brothers and Little Richard on what we call in the United States the Chitlin Circuit, the segregated circuit for black musicians. He moved to England, and he found 2 great bandmates there, and they formed a band. They changed the way music is heard. They not only changed the way music is played, fusing Bob Dylan and soul and the Beatles and psychedelia, they invented new technology. They worked hard on amplification and distortion devices and echo systems and new kinds of speakers. And when Jimi Hendrix got enough money, he built himself his own startup company. He built himself a recording studio, Electric Ladyland, where he took the control booth from behind the window where the engineers could control the means of production, and he put it around living room furniture where the musicians themselves could record. And that's why, to this day, we still have new music from Jimi Hendrix, who died at 27, coming out each and every year. You see, you never know where that creative inspiration will spark. We think it goes from scientist to scientist, from technologist to technologist, from musician to musician, designer to designer. But that isn't the way creativity works at all. Creativity is something we share. It requires us to share it, to interact, and to spur it together. It is something that is quintessentially human, but emerges in our communities. It is the product of our cities and the communities we build. Thank you so much for listening to me. I think we have time for a couple questions.
Richard, thank you very much indeed.
Thank
you. That was really most edifying. We do have some time for some questions. I think we have some roving microphones as well. Do we have any questions from the audience? I have a question that we'll just put to you straight away, Richard, while anybody's busy gathering their thoughts, because you've given us a whole stack of information, a vast resource of information to consume and absorb. It could take a little while to formulate these. One of the issues that you covered quite extensively in the book, obviously, is the creative index, the 3 T's that you talked about earlier. And you touched on a key element in there, and that is that the talent that we're talking about that will drive the creativity in these cities is mobile. The factories are less mobile. They stuck down their roots. So then we're going to have some serious implications for the urban environments of the future, how we deal with those, urban infrastructure, the physical planning, architectural work. And of course, from a city management point of view and a city government point of view, even a national government point of view for that matter, serious implications for legislation, for regulation, for education. How do we prepare our cities looking forward for this essential future?
Well, it's a great question. And I think for this group, the most important thing I can say is aesthetics may be part of the equation, but they're far from everything. And you could build a city with the most beautiful buildings and the most spectacular roadways and the most high-performing trains, and it could fail. Because what this talented group is really attracted to is not just the quality and beauty of the buildings, it's the energy that exists between us. That's where the most talented people are flowing to. You know, people talk about New York's a great city, but John F. Kennedy Airport is horrific. The subway is dirty. You know, things are covered with graffiti. It doesn't have this particular aesthetic appeal, a high aesthetic appeal, although there are beautiful things there. Same could be said of many cities that are great cities. It's the heart and soul and energy of the city. And I think as designers, that's something that we have to really be focused. And that's what, it's not like very talented and creative people know what they want. It's not that they're seeking out, they just find that energy. And that's what my research really tries to grapple with. What are the characteristics of that energy? How do we harness it, and how do we know it when we see it? One last thing I will say is in our rush to build the new, sometimes we forget how important the old is. And that's true across our world in this, and the Americans are the worst at eradicating our history. But Jane Jacobs told me something really fundamental. She said, new ideas require old buildings. New ideas require these historic structures with the modern, with the new. And if you look at these great creative energized districts, they're often a mix of the old, the ancient, and the very new and the hyper-modern. So I think it's a balance, but the most important thing is to focus on that human element and that human energy.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience? Gentleman in the front row. Do we have a mic, please?
I was, of course, extremely impressed by your presentation in every way. And I was going back to some of the first comments you made about Marx. And the fact that, in a way, your work, your research, your thinking is covering some of the ground that he covered in a formidable way of understanding the phenomenal shift in the cultural and industrial and social life of the world 100, 200 years ago. My question is concerning the ideology behind your delivery. In a way, what was fundamental in Marx is that it wasn't only the profound understanding of the inherent dangers inherent in capitalism, but also the question as to whether a major change of ideology might not be part of that major mutation that he was anticipating and hoping for. Yep. So my question is, in a sense, the discourse that you have given us with amazing conviction still seems to be anchored in capitalism. Yep. It is anchored in an extrapolation, almost an exponential extrapolation of capitalism. So my question is, do you foresee, in your visionary way, do you foresee also a shift in the ideological substratum of the major changes that you're talking about? And I'm, in a way, comparing you with Marx, which is a very difficult challenge, but I think fundamental at the degree of thinking that you have reached, the ideological question cannot be left out of the equation.
Well, first of all, thank you for that question and for that deep understanding of my own work. I think that I'm less inclined to believe that there will be a major break with capitalism because of the same thing that tripped up Marx. Marx saw this shift from the capitalism, market-based competition, to a kind of next stage of socialism, which really never emerged. There are lots of things that emerged. Intersubjective production, the fact that we're all involved in making things. Marx actually anticipated the rise of the knowledge economy. So my hunch is that what we're living through is, as you aptly said, the next mutation of capitalism to a kind of higher form, a purer form of capitalism. That said, both Jane Jacobs and Peter Drucker, who influenced me a lot, as well as Marx, believe that there was something new in the age of urban knowledge-based capitalism that could be a break. That could be a break with the kind of capitalism that came before. In Drucker's last works, he was talking about the movement away from a capitalistic society where voluntary association rather than exploitative economic relations. I think it's still too early to, maybe I'm being cautious, still too early to make that prediction, but I do think we're on the verge of, at minimum, a new kind of capitalism, hopefully one that we can make far less unequal, that we can encourage prosperity, but we may be on the verge of a possible new kind of order, which I or no one else has yet defined. But I think what you've identified is the fundamental question going forward. How much of this economic break will be a break with the systems we have come to know? And we can talk more about that in a bit.
I think we have time for another question. Gentleman in the third row.
Just a very light question, actually. It's not, I think it's too heavy question from other two peoples. So, which city in the world that you find very close to the cities driven by design as your definitions? So that we can take as examples or reference, or we can take a look to, or I don't know. Is it Toronto?
Toronto is very interesting because what's interesting in Toronto is if you had asked me 10 years ago, it has good design, it has great architecture, it was a very progressive city, it was a city that wasn't class divided, but in fact has become very divided and given rise to this crazy mayor that, you know, I read about this morning in the Hong Kong news and the Spanish news, and he represents this divided city, the city of success at the core and marginalization at the periphery. I think there are many, you'll hear from Barcelona later, a city that is in terms of design and aesthetics and the street level, one of the most amazing in the world, London. I think in terms of this less formalistic design, this kind of complexity, emergent design, I still think you'd be hard-pressed to beat New York City. And what I think's interesting about New York City, not only with Bloomberg, but post-Bloomberg, is the fact that it is now not only a center of artistic and cultural creativity, finance, and media, it is attracting a massive migration of high-tech companies. And this, I think, is very important. The high-tech companies, especially for those of you in Hong Kong and Asia and other places that are still building these districts, innovation hubs in the suburban periphery, what we're finding in the United States, but also in the UK and London, is this migration of the high-tech companies back to the urban center. The same loft buildings, older buildings that used to be artist studios or places where musicians are now becoming in the places that the high-tech companies are incubating. It's no longer a fake city that they want, it's a real city that they want. So I think New York represents that, but it also represents this dividing. You know, as the tech companies and the artistic uses and the design companies move to the center, now there becomes back to Marx, a class conflict, a class divide represented in New York in the election of this new mayor de Blasio, who won his mayoralty on this notion of he has to bridge the gap of the wealthy city and the poor city, no longer a city for the global rich, a city for everyone. So I think focusing on the creative city, not only as a city of a creative elite, but as a city for everyone's creativity, is really the key. And in that sense, we could point at many cities, and maybe the real answer is there are many different models from many different cities, but if I had to pick one city that is at the center of this, I would think New York City would be one great example.
Just my favorite city, actually.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have now run out of time. Richard, thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Patrick.
Excellent presentation.
Thanks, everyone.